Nairobi woke up lazily but confidently, as it always did with this city. Endless rows of cars, motorcycles, and people, merging into one endless river of business bustle, began their movement in the early morning, as if someone invisible turned on the general signal to start. The huge office building sticking into the sky seemed to be pulling all the tension, as if something special was going to happen today. But for Misika, every day was the same. He did not believe in chance, did not trust fate, and always knew that everything he had was the result of his hard work, perseverance, and, of course, iron discipline. Misika was not just an ordinary boss at a company that was considered one of the most promising in the field of technology in East Africa. He was a self-made man. His path to the top was full of cruel trials, meetings with dubious partners, cunning competitors, and countless nights without sleep. He knew that he could only trust himself, that in a world where everyone wanted to grab their piece, there was no place for weakness. Misika believed that it was his tough approach to work and uncompromising attitude that led him to success. And moreover, he could not afford to lower the bar for the sake of some emotions, or, worse, for the sake of subordinates. He followed his main rule: never mix work and personal affairs. But that was exactly the rule that was about to collapse, even if he didn't realize it himself yet. Amadi appeared in his life unexpectedly, as those who turn everything upside down often do. The first time Misika saw her resume on the table, he didn't even pay much attention to it. She looked like one of the hundreds of candidates who aspired to join his company, hoping that they could make a career in such a prestigious place. Misika was sure that none of them would be able to surprise him, but Amadi surprised me. Not only did she demonstrate incredible skills with programs and solutions that none of her colleagues could have mastered so quickly, but she also showed wit, audacity, and complete disregard for hierarchy. She was not afraid to challenge, argue, and persistently offer her ideas, even if her opinion went against that of Misika. And this, as you know, was not forgiven to any employee. On the day Amadi crossed the Mesike Road for the first time, he stood at the window of his office, watching the sun's rays break through the thick clouds. Nairobi, all this chaos, was for him something like a mirror, a city that he knew and which seemed manageable to him if you keep all the strings under control. Amadi has become an exception to the rule. She came to a meeting on a project that was considered to be on the verge of failure. All previous attempts by the team to solve the problem have only led to even greater losses and delays. No one could offer anything intelligible. Amadi, being a junior specialist, was supposed to just sit in the corner and listen. But no, she stood up in the middle of the meeting and calmly began to talk about how the project could be saved, but it was necessary to act differently. Her calmness, confidence, and apparent lack of understanding that she was just a junior employee attracted the attention of everyone in the room.
And what do you suggest?
Misika asked her coldly, without taking his eyes off the papers.
Completely redesign the architecture of the system.
Amadi replied without batting an eye.
It sounds like something complicated, but in fact, it's pretty simple.
There was a moment of silence in the room. Misika continued to sort through the papers, but it was clear from the expression on his face that he had heard her words. But he is not used to being pointed out to mistakes. It was unacceptable.
You must understand,
he said after a long pause,
that this means delays and an even greater reduction in profits. Are you ready to be responsible for this?
If nothing is done, the project will fail anyway, and so we have a chance.
Misika froze. He was sure that the girl would break under the pressure now. It has always been so. People came to him with ideas and then lost their composure when he asked about the real responsibility for their words. But Amadi stood like a stone wall. Her confidence was almost palpable, and to his surprise, she didn't let up. For a moment, Misika felt something strange, a slight irritation mixed with interest. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially from someone like inexperienced, but confident in her abilities. It was both challenging and attractive. He didn't like the idea that someone could shake his confidence in his leadership, but at this moment he couldn't help but acknowledge her audacity. He put down the papers and finally looked up at Amadi. Her figure stood in the dim light of the conference room, and he noticed how her dark eyes sparkled with stubbornness. Her face was calm, almost cold, but there was incredible strength in her posture, in the way she held her head.
We'll see.
He said, nodding and gesturing that the meeting was over. But Amadi, she was a different case. As the weeks passed, Misika found himself thinking about her more and more often. He didn't understand why this particular woman, who was just one of hundreds of employees, suddenly began to occupy his thoughts. She continued to work on the project, showing her professional competence, and every time they crossed paths in the corridors of the company, he felt a strange tension between them. It was an almost invisible electricity, as if they were separated by only a thin line that he was ready to cross, but did not dare yet. Amadi didn't seem to notice the changes in their interaction. She remained the same confident, cocky and independent. I've never fawned, I've never tried to make an impression, and this only increased his interest. She was like a complicated puzzle that he hadn't solved yet. Several weeks have passed since the day when Amadi first openly spoke at a meeting, challenging Misika himself. For her, it was just another day at work, which she perceived as an ordinary necessity to solve problems where no one can. For Misika, that day was a turning point. He found himself thinking more and more often that despite his uncompromising professional philosophy, something about this woman was bothering him. And then one day, fate brought them together again. The company was diving into a new project, ambitious and requiring a detailed approach. Hundreds of small elements had to come together to be successful. The project team was on the verge of collapse. Everything was moving slowly, and the deadline was already hanging like a dark cloud over the heads of employees. The project was so difficult that many people lost motivation or refused responsibility altogether. But Amadi, as always, found herself in the center of events. Her professionalism, fortitude, and endless energy inspired those who had time to lose heart. She walked forward, not noticing the obstacles, but also leaving no chance for those who would like to see her fail. Misika, as always, watched all this from the height of his office. He did not interfere in the process, as usual. His management methods were ironclad: to give the team complete freedom of action and then demand the result. But more and more often his gaze lingered on Amadi. He saw how she solved problems one by one, how she didn't waste a second. His inner voice was trying to remind him of the main rule, not to mess with subordinates. But everything he knew about himself was gradually losing weight next to her persistence. One day, as another project meeting was coming to an end, Misika noticed a tension in the air. The staff were sitting in the conference room, and the atmosphere was so tense that you could almost hear them mentally giving up. The deadline was just around the corner, and there were still no solutions. Many averted their eyes, afraid to say something that would show their weakness. Amadi was sitting in the corner with her arms crossed over her chest, staring intently at the diagrams on the screen. It was at this moment that Misika realized that it was time to intervene. He had to either inspire the team or admit defeat already, but something inside him suggested that this project was not lost. Just then, Amadi got to her feet.
I'll take it,
she said sharply, breaking the gloomy silence. Her voice sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. In the hall, several employees could be heard whispering nervously among themselves. Surprised by her determination, Misika did not even try to hide his interest. He understood that Amadi was once again taking on responsibilities that no one wanted, and it was at that moment that he felt something move inside him. He couldn't let her handle it alone, even though his whole being was against him interfering himself. But she had become too important a figure in his mind. In the evening of the same day, the office gradually emptied. Only a few employees stayed behind for the final verification of the data before sending it to customers. Misika was in no hurry to leave. Watching the rest of them through the glass wall of his office, he could see Amadi still sitting at his desk, concentrating on some documents. Her tenacity amazed. A clock in the hallway ticked softly, and the lights in the building gradually went out. After a few minutes, everyone except Amadi and Misika left the office. He couldn't leave her alone with so much work. It wasn't his style, although he hadn't meddled in her business up to that point. This time it was different. Misika came out of his office, and his footsteps echoed down the empty hallway. He went straight to her desk. His voice was neutral, but there was a slight note of concern in it. Amadi looked up from her computer. Her face was calm as always, but there was fatigue mixed with determination in her eyes. She sighed, stretched, and finally said,
Yes, I want to finish at least part of it before morning. I can't leave everything for tomorrow. There's too much at stake.
Misika did not respond immediately. He stood in front of her, trying to figure out what it was that made him look for her more and more often, more and more interested in her actions. He wasn't the type to give in to impulses, but now, something was different now.
Let's see what we can do,
He said after a long pause, coming closer and sitting down opposite her. Amadi was a little surprised by his suggestion. It seemed to her that Misika was not one of those who stayed after work to help subordinates, but she didn't ask too many questions. Their communication was always short and to the point. She just nodded, switching back to the monitor screen. They worked in silence. Time seemed to slow down, leaving them alone in this deserted office. Misika studied each document with the same seriousness with which Amadi dealt with the data. Their synchronicity was amazing. It seemed that a tacit understanding had been established between them that did not need words. Periodically, they exchanged short phrases, essentially without unnecessary emotions. But something in the air between them was changing. The invisible boundary that had always existed began to fade as the hours dragged on endlessly. It had long been dark outside the windows, and only moonlight penetrated into the office, softly illuminating the desks and monitors. At some point, Amadi felt her gaze linger on Misika's face. She noticed how his brows furrowed as he read the reports, how his fingers drummed nervously on the table as he pondered. Her attention suddenly shifted from work to him, and it was unusual. She always tried to keep her distance, not allowing herself to be distracted by personal moments. But now something has changed. She tried to push those thoughts away, but her body gave her away. Her heart began to beat faster, and at that moment Misika looked up. Their gazes crossed for a few seconds, but that brief moment was so intense that she felt like she was having a hard time breathing. They sat opposite each other, not saying a word, but there was a whole storm of emotions hidden in the silence, which both tried to suppress. Misika was the first to look away, going back to work as if nothing had happened. But Amadi knew that this was not the case. This moment was more than just an accident, and she began to realize that their relationship could no longer remain the same as before. By nightfall, they had finally finished working on the project. Amadi got up from the table, stretched, and looked at her watch.
It's getting late.
She said. Misika nodded, but continued to sit at the table. He couldn't just walk away like nothing had happened. It seemed to him that this evening had changed something between them, and this thought haunted him. As she headed for the exit, he felt something inside him tighten sharply, as if an invisible force was trying to stop him. But he didn't do anything. He just watched her disappear through the door, leaving him alone in an empty office filled with the soft echo of her footsteps. After that night, when the two of them stayed in the office, something in the relationship between Misika and Amadi changed, but it was difficult to define in words. They have not become closer in the classical sense of the word. There were no obvious changes on the surface. They still communicated with restraint, professionally, avoiding unnecessary words. But something elusive has already penetrated their interaction. It was as if a thin thread, invisible to outsiders, stretched between them, connecting them more and more. Amadi continued to work on the project, and her success was obvious to everyone. Her colleagues began to respect her, although some were still whispering behind her back, discussing her audacity and independence. But she didn't pay attention to the rumors. She was only interested in the result. She knew that she had the support of Misika himself, although they did not discuss it openly. His behavior changed. He no longer looked down on her, did not ignore her suggestions in meetings. Now he was listening to her attentively, as if every word she said was important. One day, the company hosted a corporate party. It was something of a tradition to celebrate the successes and achievements of each quarter. This time, they gathered in one of the prestigious hotels in the city. The glitter of the lights, luxurious costumes, champagne, laughter, and music. All this created a festive atmosphere, but for Misika, it was just another duty. He was not a fan of such events, preferring to stay in the shadows. watching what was happening from a distance. He knew that his presence was important for employees because the boss should always demonstrate his involvement, even if he himself was not interested in all this. He stood apart from the main crowd, with a glass in his hand, watching his team enjoy the evening. The music was loud, and people seemed to be completely immersed in dancing and talking. But among all these faces, his gaze kept returning to one thing, to Amadi. She was standing at the other end of the hall, talking to one of her colleagues. Her slight smile lit up her face, and her eyes shone with life. Her figure was graceful but confident. As always, she didn't need the approval of others. She radiated independence, and this made Misiki feel something that he had been trying to suppress for a long time. He couldn't take his eyes off her even when he tried. She attracted his attention like no one else. It was something beyond his control, and he knew it. An inner voice reminded him again of the rules, that it was not worth crossing the invisible line that he had set for himself. But it was getting more difficult with every passing moment. Amadi, feeling his gaze on her, turned and met his eyes. She didn't look away as she would have done before. A spark ran between them, almost palpable on a physical level. It was a silent communication, without words, without movements, but full of hidden emotions. The evening went on, but the tension between them grew. Memsika understood that everything was heading towards some inevitable moment when they would no longer be able to simply ignore this attraction. And this moment came suddenly, like a bolt from the blue. As the party was coming to an end, people began to disperse. Amadi seemed to be about to leave too. She was already heading for the elevator when Mesike, without thinking, just followed her. It was an impulsive decision that he didn't have time to think about. There was silence inside the elevator. Only the sound of the fan broke it. Amadi stood in front of him, silent, but it was clear from her tense posture that she, too, felt this invisible tension between them. She didn't look at him, even though she knew he was watching her. The air around them seemed to be getting thicker by the second. Jessica couldn't hold back any longer. He took a step forward, closer to her. Amadi froze, her heart beating faster, but she didn't move. She also felt like something was changing between them. His voice was low but full of hidden power. It was the first word he had spoken since they entered the elevator. She turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were calm, but there was a fire in the depths that she could no longer hide. They were standing too close, their bodies almost touching. Amsike didn't know what to say next. All thoughts disappeared. There was only one thing left: desire. The desire to be closer to her, to feel her, to break the barrier that had separated them for so long. He couldn't ignore it anymore.
I shouldn't.
He began but stopped. Amadi stared at him in silence, her breathing becoming a little more rapid. She understood what he was talking about. She knew that their relationship could not be simple, that it violated all the rules that he had set for himself. But at that moment, it all seemed unimportant. She couldn't hold herself back anymore either.
You shouldn't.
She repeated softly, as if confirming his words. Her voice was low, but there was the same determination in it that he had seen in her eyes. At that moment, everything changed. The spark that had flared between them at the corporate party had now turned into a flame that could not be extinguished. MCK took another step, reducing the distance between them to a minimum. Their breaths mingled and Misika's hands lightly touched hers, as if he hadn't made up his mind yet. But this light, almost invisible contact was so powerful that Amadi felt a wave of warmth run through her body. She looked at his hand, then back at him, and didn't take a step back. She didn't turn away, didn't try to leave. Her whole body said that she had been waiting for this moment as much as he had. They both knew it was wrong, that it violated all the rules, but at this point, they were no longer interested in the rules.
This is crazy,
he said, but his voice sounded weaker now, as if he was saying this not to her, but to himself, trying to find an excuse for what was happening.
Crazy.
George lay. She agreed, and a slight, almost invisible smile appeared on her face. They stood motionless for a few more moments, as if the world had frozen around them. Their whole world was reduced to this small space of the elevator, to this silence, and to those emotions that they could no longer control. When the elevator finally stopped and the doors opened, they seemed to wake up. The world started moving again, but things were already different between them. Amadi was the first to get out of the elevator, Her steps were fast, as if she was trying to escape from what had just happened, but deep down, she knew she couldn't run away from it. Mesika remained standing in place. He watched her departing figure, and it seemed to him that he was missing something important. But he didn't follow her. He stayed in the empty elevator, listening to his heart, still beating faster than usual. A spark was kindled between them, but it was only the first step. Now they both knew that their relationship would never be the same. Several days have passed since the evening when Amadi and Mesika found themselves in the elevator together. The world seemed to have returned to its tracks, and life flowed back to its usual rhythm, but something subtly changed in their relationship. Outwardly, they were still professional and cool. No one in the office could notice the changes. Amadi continued her duties, immersed in projects, discussions, and reports. As always, Mesika led the team from his office, restrained and resolute, as if he did not give free rein to his feelings. But now their every glance, casual contact, or just the presence of each other in the same room created a tension that was almost unbearable. No one talked about it out loud, but there was a dynamic in their relationship that couldn't be ignored. Every time their eyes met through the glass walls of the office or during meetings, it was like an instant electric shock. They both knew that the passing spark had already lit a fire that was not so easy to extinguish. This fire broke out for the first time during one of these meetings. The team gathered to discuss the progress of the project, which was led by Amadi. The atmosphere was tense, deadlines were being squeezed, and the result was still in question. Amadi stood at the blackboard, demonstrating new ideas and solutions. Her voice was confident, as always, but her thoughts wandered far from technical issues. She couldn't concentrate fully on her work. Every time she looked up to meet Mesika's gaze, her heart started beating faster. It was against her rules, against her principles. She always considered herself a professional who was not distracted by personal things. But in his presence, everything became different. Mesika, sitting at the table, stared at her intently. His gaze was not the same as before. It was not just an interest in her, not just an assessment of her professional qualities. He looked at her as if she were a woman he wanted to understand, get to know better. He struggled with this feeling. His whole character was built on control, on strict boundaries that he never crossed. But now the boundaries were blurring every day. After the meeting, when everyone had already started to leave, Amadi lingered, putting the papers in order. Mesika remained in the office, but his gaze was fixed on her. He watched her carefully fold the documents, how her hands moved quickly and confidently, how her silhouette loomed in the semi-darkness of the evening office lighting. At that moment, he realized that he couldn't resist anymore. The attraction has become too strong. Later that evening, when most of the staff had already gone home, Amadi was still in the office, working on documents. She knew she was alone, but the feeling of loneliness disappeared as soon as she heard footsteps outside the door. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to do that to figure out who had entered the room. She felt his presence even before he was there. Mesika came closer, stopping a few steps away from her. The air between them became thick as an electrified field, and their breathing quickened, although they still did not touch each other. In that instant, everything changed. The space between them was reduced to a minimum, their bodies almost touching. It was not a deliberate action, but rather something intuitive, natural. Mesika slowly extended his hand, and his fingers lightly touched her shoulder. This touch was so light that it could have gone unnoticed, but for them it was the beginning. They both felt it. Amadi froze, feeling a wave of warmth run through her body. It was a gentle touch, but there was a hidden power in it that made her freeze in place. She didn't know what to expect next, but she couldn't pull away either. Her heart was beating loudly, like an echo in an empty office, and with every second she realized that she could not go back. This was the moment when all her inner struggle, all her resistance collapsed. Mesika, sensing her reaction, did not make any sudden movements. He knew that rushing things would be a mistake. His hand slowly descended along her back, his fingers gently touching her skin through the thin fabric of her blouse, and each touch seemed to awaken something inside her. It was more than a physical attraction. It was the moment when their souls, their minds and bodies became one. Although they both did not fully realize it, she could have walked away, She could have pulled away, but she didn't. She stayed where she was, her body not protesting, although her mind was still trying to appeal to her sanity. At that moment, reason no longer mattered. All the barriers they had built for themselves had collapsed. Amadi turned her head slightly, and their faces were so close to each other that they could feel each other's breath. It was a game on the edge. Every breath they took, every moment when they didn't touch each other's lips, was saturated with hidden desire. In the days that followed, they both continued to live a double life. Nothing has changed for everyone around us. Their working relationship remained at the same level, strictly professional, even somewhat cold. But deep down, they both knew that what was happening between them had become something more than just a fleeting passion. They began to look for moments to be alone, in the shadows, away from prying eyes. Their secret meetings were spontaneous, almost accidental, but each time they became more passionate. The first touch in the elevator, which had once seemed so electrifying, now seemed insignificant compared to what they were experiencing. They met after work, when the office was already empty, and every time their bodies touched, it was like an explosion, as if all the accumulated charge of emotions between them was discharged in an instant. They no longer needed words. Their bodies spoke for them. Every gesture, every touch was filled with those feelings that they had been trying to hide for so long. When Emsika touched her hand, it wasn't just a touch. It was a confession that he couldn't fight himself anymore. When Amadi clung to him, her body told him that she felt the same way, but their affair was doomed to remain a secret. They both knew they couldn't afford to be open. Any mistake could destroy everything, their career, reputation, and the trust of their colleagues. Every time they met, they realized that this might be the last time. But it was this realization that made their moments together even more passionate and valuable. Every time they were together, they felt more and more attracted to each other. Their passion grew with each meeting, but so did their fear. The fear of being discovered, the fear of losing control, the fear that someone from their environment will start to suspect something. They began to be more and more cautious, meeting in places where no one could see them, avoiding long conversations in the office, but this only fueled their desire. After all, the more they hid, the more they realized how much they wanted each other. Inside the office, they remained professionals. Amadi continued to work on projects, leading the team to success, and Emsika supported her with his cold detachment. But outside the walls of the office, their lives turned into one big contradiction. They couldn't be together, but they couldn't be apart either. That's how their secret romance began, filled with passion, hidden glances and meetings in the dark where no one could see them. Their every move was steeped in risk, but that only made their bond even more powerful, and they both knew it couldn't last forever. But as long as they were together, everything else seemed unimportant. Their romance, so intense and exciting, eventually began to resemble a game on the edge of a precipice. The deeper they delved into each other, the more they realized that reality was catching up with them faster than they expected. Secret meetings, furtive glances exchanged, and kisses in the shadow of the office became part of their lives. But with each new meeting, more and more dangers loomed over them. At first, it was just a feeling of anxiety. Amadi noticed how her colleagues began to look at her with suspicion more often. Sometimes it seemed to her that there was not only interest in their views, but also condemnation. Her career was growing rapidly, and her achievements at work could not be ignored. She attracted attention not only for her professionalism, but also for her confident behavior. People around her began to wonder what exactly allowed her to climb the career ladder so quickly. Some were just jealous, others were whispering behind their backs. But Amadi couldn't help but notice how her reputation was becoming increasingly fragile. She tried not to think about how this would affect her relationships with her colleagues. While working on projects, she continued to demonstrate the highest level of competence, but her thoughts increasingly wandered in another direction. Each of her interactions with MCK became a test of strength. She felt her concentration on work waning every day, and her mind became more and more consumed by thoughts of him. Masika also began to notice changes in their relationship. If earlier his iron discipline and composure allowed him to clearly separate work from his personal life, Now these boundaries have begun to blur. His habit of keeping everything under control was failing. He couldn't just ignore his desire to be with her anymore. Her every appearance in the office caused him confusion, which he tried in vain to hide. He noticed that the staff began to discuss her progress. The whispers behind her grew louder, and although no one openly accused her of anything, the hints were quite clear. Colleagues who had previously treated her with respect now began to distance themselves. The whole team seemed to be divided into two camps: those who still believed in her professionalism, and those who suspected that her success was not only related to work. This atmosphere began to destroy everything they were building. The secret meetings became more difficult every day. Amadi tried to avoid unnecessary intersections with MSK in the office, but this only increased suspicions. Her behavior became increasingly nervous, and even the smallest gestures, such as hurrying away after a meeting or avoiding glances, attracted attention. Colleagues began to wonder what was going on between them, but that was just the beginning. The problems grew like an avalanche. Amadi began to have difficulty fulfilling her duties. If before she could easily cope with any tasks, now her attention was scattered as the project she was leading began to slip. Deadlines began to be missed, and her once impeccable reputation began to crumble. Errors that did not exist before have now become regular. Her confidence, which had once been her trump card, was gradually disappearing. Misika, watching this, felt an inner conflict. He saw how she was losing control of her work, how she was overwhelmed by emotional instability, but he couldn't interfere. Every action he took in her favor could be a confirmation of the rumors, and this made the situation worse. His desire to protect her collided with the need to keep his distance. He had to watch how a woman who had once been a symbol of strength and independence for him was now losing ground. Amadi tried not to show that her inner world was collapsing, but she knew she couldn't handle it alone anymore. Her nights became torturous. She lay awake, replaying everything that happened in her head. Her thoughts were filled with the fear of losing not only her job, but also the respect of those around her. But most importantly, she was afraid of losing MSK. Their relationship became a source of joy and pain for her at the same time. Every time they met, her heart sank with happiness, but the same moment brought the realization that they were on the verge. She couldn't concentrate on her work anymore. Her mind was completely occupied with thoughts about him, about how they were hiding from the whole world. Her feelings became so strong that they began to overwhelm her, destroying her ability to think straight. Every day, the tension increased. Colleagues began to notice her mistakes, and this attracted the attention of management. She was called into conversation several times, hinting that her productivity had begun to decline. Amadi felt that the situation was getting out of control, but she did not know how to fix it. She couldn't afford to lose her job, but at the same time, she couldn't give up her feelings for Misika. In turn, also began to feel pressure. He saw his staff losing confidence in him. His decisions were increasingly questioned, and rumors about his relationship with Amadi spread through the office like wildfire. Even those who had always been on his side started asking questions. His authority, which he had been building for years, began to crumble. And most importantly, he began to realize that their affair could cost him everything he had achieved. One day, when Misika stayed in the office late at night, he thought about what all this was leading to. He sat in his office, illuminated only by the dim light of a desk lamp, and stared at an empty computer screen. His head was empty, but his heart was overflowing with emotions. He knew he was trapped between his feelings and his responsibilities. He wanted to be with Amadi, but he knew it would lead to disaster. He couldn't sleep for a long time that evening. Thoughts of her, of what they had built together, of what might collapse, haunted him. He felt that time was running out, and they both needed to make a choice. But what's the choice? Give up on her? To continue living in fear of being exposed? Or should I risk everything for the sake of my feelings? Amadi was also in the throes of doubt at this time. She knew their romance couldn't last forever. She felt like every day brought new challenges, and their bond was becoming more fragile. Two opposing desires were fighting inside her, the desire to be with him and the desire to save her career. But both of these paths led nowhere. She knew that one day they would have to make a choice, but she wasn't ready for that. Every new day was filled with fear and doubt. Their secret meetings became rare, and their every move was thought out to the smallest detail. But even such caution could not save them from suspicion. The rumors spread so widely that it was no longer possible to control them. There was an atmosphere of distrust in the office. Amadi felt that she had become a stranger among her colleagues. She was isolated, and she understood that this was the result of her relationship with Masike. At some point, Amadi realized that she could no longer continue to live like this. She stood in front of the mirror in her empty office late at night, looking at her reflection. Her face was tired, her eyes full of anxiety. She no longer saw herself as the strong and independent woman she once was. Her heart was broken, her mind was full of chaos. And at that moment, she realized that they both needed to make a choice. They couldn't go on like this. A secret affair was ruining their lives, careers, and everything they had achieved. They were both at a crossroads, and there were only two paths ahead. Either they would break up forever, or they would decide on something more, despite all the consequences. The night was warm, but the darkness seemed thicker than usual, as if the city itself was plunging into this feeling of anxiety that possessed Amadi and Masike. After all the weeks of intense secret meetings, dodging and ignoring the obvious, the moment of truth has arrived. Every step, every mistake, every indecisive move brought them to this moment when they both had to make a choice that not only their careers, but also their lives depended on. Amadi stood at the window of her apartment, looking at the endless lights of Nairobi, which blinked below like small sparks reflecting her inner state. Everything she knew, everything she had built, seemed to disappear into a haze of uncertainty. Her career success, which had taken off so quickly and rapidly, now seemed to her to be something ghostly and ephemeral. Questions, whispers, and disapproving stares from colleagues had been bothering her for a long time, but she felt like every new day at work was becoming more and more unbearable. A secret romance that began with innocent attraction and passion has now turned into something destructive. What was once a source of joy and excitement has now become a constant worry and fear. She couldn't pretend that everything was under control anymore. Her heart was torn apart between her love for Masike and the realization that their relationship was ruining them both. She was forced to hide, lie not only to her colleagues, but also to herself. The moments of their meetings were replaying in my head again. They were full of passion and anxiety at the same time. Every furtive glance in the office, every touch, every kiss, all this now seemed far away and inaccessible. Their relationship began to collapse under the weight of secrets and understatement. All that remained were painful memories that weighed heavily on her mind. Masike, like Amadi, found himself in his own world of doubt. His office, which had always been a place of calm and control for him, now turned into a cage. He could no longer feel in control of the situation. The workflow seemed mechanical. Its every action became automatic, meaningless. His authority began to weaken, and employees who once believed in his steadfastness began to ask questions about his ability to run the company. He was sitting at his desk, mindlessly flipping through reports and documents, not paying attention to the numbers and data in front of him. All his attention was focused on what was going on between him and Amadi. He knew that he could no longer continue to live in this state. Every meeting with her made him feel joy, but at the same time, unbearable heaviness. Their passion no longer brought relief. It became a source of constant pressure that he could not get rid of. He often thought about what had happened, about how one young woman was able to break all his rules and principles that he had been building for years. Masike has always believed in strict control, that emotions should remain outside the workplace. But with Amadi, it was different. She came into his life, and everything he knew collapsed. He allowed himself emotions, and now it has led him to disaster. He knew that rumors about his relationship with Amadi had spread far beyond their department. His supervisors have repeatedly called him out for conversations, hinting that his decisions have become less conscious. Shit weighed on him. Everything he had built, everything he had fought for, was now under threat. One evening, when the office was empty, Masike was left alone in his office. Glancing at his watch, he realized that he could no longer delay the decision. Things have gone too far. He knew that he had to choose. Either he would continue this destructive affair, or it would all end. But whatever choice he makes, it will have serious consequences. He took the phone and stared at the screen for a long time. At the name of Amadi, which shone in front of him, his fingers slowly tightened around the phone, and he put it in his pocket. He knew he couldn't call her, couldn't tell her how he felt. Words were useless in this situation. He just walked out of the office and headed for the exit. Amadi, at this time, also came to the conclusion that something needed to be changed. Her inner conflict had reached its limit. She could no longer combine work and their romance. Every morning, when she entered the office, she was seized with fear of being exposed, fear of losing her job, fear of destroying everything that she and Misika had built together. And she knew she couldn't live in this state anymore. That night, as she sat by the window, Amadi finally made a decision. She knew that if they wanted to keep anything, they needed to end this relationship. The mystery that was once their common game has now turned into their biggest fear. She could no longer live in constant expectation that someone would find out the truth. She slowly got up from her chair, feeling the weight of her decision weighing down on her. It was inevitable. She knew it would hurt, but she knew there was no other way out. She couldn't sacrifice her career, her dreams, and perhaps her future for this relationship. It was too much. Too much for her. Too much for both of them. When they met the next day at the office, everything was as usual. They did not exchange words, did not cast a single glance at each other, but the atmosphere between them was saturated with tension. They knew that everything had come to an end. Their romance, which had once seemed so passionate and irresistible, was now consumed by fear and insecurity. Mike, lost in his thoughts, realized that this decision was the only right one. He knew that their relationship was too destructive to continue. He has already lost too much. Control over himself, the trust of colleagues, self-respect, and most importantly, he understood that their relationship could not continue without harm to everyone around. Amadi, despite the pain she felt, knew it was necessary. She couldn't let her feelings affect her work anymore. Every step she took was now imbued with the fear that her career would be ruined not by her mistakes, but by their relationship, and she was willing to sacrifice those feelings for the sake of her future. Their meeting, which could have been ordinary on any other day, this time became symbolic. They both knew it was goodbye, saying goodbye to what could have been something more, but it saying goodbye to what had been their shared secret, but had turned into a burden that could not be carried any further. It's been a few weeks. Their paths gradually diverged. Amadi returned to her work, focusing on her projects, trying to restore the reputation she had almost lost. Her successes returned, and her colleagues gradually began to forget about the rumors. Misika, on the other hand, set about restoring his authority, once again becoming the tough leader he always was. But their memories of what happened between them remained. They both knew that this affair was something special for them, but they also understood that it couldn't go on. They made their decision, and despite the pain it brought, they both knew it was the right choice. Sometimes, when they were alone, they remembered the moments they shared together, passion, secret meetings, that electrifying moment in the elevator that started it all. But now they were just memories that should have been left in the past. Their lives went on as they should have, but inside them there will always be a memory of what could have been if the circumstances had been different. They were free of their feelings now, but that freedom came at a price they both realized too late.